It may be a new year, but we're still talking about the same old CGC situation. They have just posted an update this evening revealing 349 books that have been impacted or potentially impacted by the alleged scammer. So there's been a lot of content out already talking about the list, but let's dive into the data just a little bit and get a little more granular with the details that CGC just released to us this evening. Okay, so as I mentioned, we got a brand new update from CGC tonight. Essentially, what this is, they released the listing of books they think may be impacted. And beyond that, they provided some clarity of what steps you can take if you do happen to be in possession of one of these books. Straight from the release here, it says, if you purchased one of the comic books included in this list, you can submit it to CGC Comics for review. Now, they've got instructions on there for that. If it is determined that your book is correctly graded, it will be reholdered with a new certification number and returned at no charge. I think that's great. That's probably the absolute best thing they could do. Now, the flip side of that, if your book is determined to be incorrectly graded, our support team is going to reach out to you. So that's going to suck. At that point, they may ask you for some additional documentation just as they review the situation. Now, additionally, they follow that with saying the list of impacted books will be periodically updated as books are submitted to be reviewed, and that their goal is to remove all of the impacted certification numbers from the market to ensure that anybody who purchased one of these books is appropriately compensated for their losses arising from any failures in their services. And that's straight from the release. So the short version of this is there were 349 books that were impacted. At least that's what they've identified at this point and released for us. Of those 349, I think one of the surprising things, just based off what we'd assumed we knew at the beginning stages of this, is that there were only 8 Mark Jewelers variants that were identified out of the 349 books. And then another 5 were Canadian price variants. Just some of those odd little niche variations of the books, that can drive the values a lot higher. And I think the thing that really caught my attention in looking at this is that the overwhelming majority of the books that are impacted, at least as far as this first list is concerned, they're mostly Amazing Spider-Man comics. Upwards of 2/3 of the list were various issues of Amazing Spider-Man. There were only 32 issues of Incredible Hulk that were impacted. Secret Wars, there were 15 of those pointed out. And then there were also 12 issues of Fantastic Four books that were impacted. These aren't all single issues. Most of the titles have more than one issue number that was impacted. So let's start off with Amazing Spider-Man. First off, like I said, 236 of the 349 books impacted were Amazing Spider-Man issues. And I mean, I get it. My guy Spider-Man, he's awesome. And when you think about it, if you're trying to do something like this, you don't want to pick books that might not move very often. Spider-Man is always one of the most popular characters. And as you see when we get into the next slide and talk about the specific issues, the alleged scammer was focusing on books that are very liquid, books that turn very, very frequently. And, ASM 300, I think, makes up a shockingly large percentage of this list. I don't think that's what we expected when this thing first kicked off, but with a total of 104 copies, that's almost 30% of the entire list of impacted books were all Amazing Spider-Man 300s. So that's pretty crazy. But when you stop and think about it, that does track because ASM 300 is the most graded book that CGC has. So like I said, it's easy to hide when you're playing in the biggest pond out there. So you've got more ASM 300s floating around than any other CGC graded book. So you can slip by things like this, unfortunately, if that's what you really want to do, as this alleged scammer is proving to us at this point. So as far as getting into the details of the Amazing Spider-Man title, again, ASM 300 leads the pack across the total list with the highest number of impacted copies with 104 copies. Now, I did not go through and pull up each and every one of these and see if I was even able to determine if they were newsstand or directs. That information was not readily available on the list, short of going through each certification number and manually pulling it. Next up is Amazing Spider-Man 194. Of course, we know that's the first appearance of Black Cat. And surprisingly, this is the second most impacted book behind ASM 300. I don't think we expected that. So it looks like this particular alleged scammer was really focusing in on late bronze, early copper, just again, books that there are a lot of out there. Next up, ASM 238. Honestly, I expected there to be a lot more of this one. The whole tattoo swapping thing has been well known in the hobby for years. So it was just my expectation that this was probably a book that this guy was going after and would probably make up a high number of the books that were involved in this. And I guess ultimately 36, that's 10% of the total population of impacted books as far as this first list, or the list that we have thus far, is concerned. So that's still a fairly decent number. The fourth most impacted issue of Amazing Spider-Man was 252, which, as we all know, is the book that kicked all of this off. ASM 252 was the example that 9.9 Newsstand brought forward when all of this kicked off. To see that book making up such a small percentage of the overall total books that we've identified at this point, I think it's pretty cool. But honestly, I'm not surprised, because books like specifically ASM 252, and then another book we're going to talk about here in a second, Secret Wars 8, there's such a wide range in colors on the covers for those books. So you can have, specifically with Secret Wars 8, you can have the really pale orangey background. You have a really like blood red or blood orange, almost red background on Secret Wars 8. 252 is very similar, where it can almost fade into a pinky color, or it can be a lot bolder of a color strike. And I think that's ultimately, what let 9.9 Newsstand know that something fishy was going on. So those are the heavy hitters for Amazing Spider-Man. Other issues that were impacted, and these were significantly fewer. There were 4 copies of 361, 3 copies of 129, 3 copies of ASM 3, 2 ASM 50s, 2 ASM 15s, and then it drops down to where there was just a few one-offs of some different issues, including an ASM 1, an ASM 2, and ASM 14. So some decent books in there. But again, those were one-offs and not books that the alleged scammer really focused in on and did at any kind of quantity. Our second most impacted title is Incredible Hulk. This again is not surprising, as right out of the gate, a couple 181s were identified as being tampered with, as appearing to have been swapped around. Automatic Comics did a great job finding one of these. The CGC board members started identifying additional copies, including the one that I originally reported on. But all in all, 19 copies of Hulk 181 were included on this list in various grades. The other issue of Incredible Hulk that we find here is Hulk 340. I don't think this is a surprising thing with the value boost that's out there with a Mark Jewelers version of Hulk 340. But even with that in mind, only 2 of the listed certification numbers for Incredible Hulk 340 were noted as being Mark's Jewelers variants. So 2 out of the 13, that's a little low. I probably would have expected more. And I think, as I touched on in the beginning, the overall number of Mark's Jewelers variants is pretty low. So I think that is probably still one of the most surprising things to come out of this. Is at the beginning, we thought that was going to be a major focus of this scam, of this whole situation, but it's not shaping up to be the case as we get into it and discover more and more. Next up, mentioned this book a little bit earlier about being able to pick out some of the details with the color strikes and just the variations of colors across different examples. Secret Wars 8 was up there with 15 impacted copies. We had 4 Canadian price variants and 1 Mark Jewelers included in that. So 1/3 of the Secret Wars 8 that were listed were these special variations that do tend to add additional value. So that tracks more in line with our initial thought, or at least our assumption about this scam. But overall, again, it doesn't seem like the focus on those variations is as strong as what we originally expected it to be. As we get past the ASM, a lot of the impacted titles are pretty low amounts, with ASM taking up, like I said, 2/3 of all the impacted copies. Our next most impacted title is Fantastic Four. FF had a total of 12 impacted issues. There were 4 copies of FF12, which I thought was really unusual. 3 copies of 48, 3 copies of 45. So a little Silver Surfer and Inhumans action there. And then 2 copies of FF2 with that great scroll cover from way back in the early days of the Fantastic Four. Our next most impacted title is Uncanny X-Men, or just X-Men for issues 94 and 141 officially. Uncanny X-Men 266 is a book that I don't think anyone would be surprised to see on this list. It's kind of shocking that only 5 copies were identified by CGC up to this point. Now, 2 of those 5 were Mark Jeweller's variants. So maybe the good news here, and this is just pure speculation, maybe we caught this guy fairly early into him really going down the Mark Jeweller's rabbit hole, or the Canadian Price variant rabbit hole, or just, those niche markets. Maybe this is something he was just starting to warm up to as the community caught on to this. So in a way, it's kind of good to see that most of this list isn't made up of that kind of a book, which to me just implies that, again, we might have caught this in the early stages. Let's hope. Next up, X-Men 94, 3 copies of that book, 1 copy of 141, and then 1 copy of Uncanny X-Men 148, which was a double cover. If you're wondering why that particular issue was in there, my guess would be that that book may have been swapped out for a book that was not a double cover. It may just be a regular 148 in the case if it was in fact one of the books that the alleged scammer did switch out. Now, all told, there were about 30 different titles that were included in the list that CGC released. Up to this point, I've just focused on the titles that had the most issues impacted. Let's talk about just some notable single issues that were included in the balance of the list that I haven't talked about up to this point. The highest quantity issue that wasn't otherwise featured in one of the larger titles is New Mutants 98. There were 9 copies of that book alone that were included on the list from CGC. Of those 9 issues of New Mutants 98, 2 of them were Mark Jeweller's variants. So 2 out of 9, again, not as many as I would have originally expected, but still a couple in there. This is where, from here, I kind of want to pivot to talk about some of the bigger books that were on the list. There weren't a lot of them quantity-wise, but just a few misdeeds amongst these next several books I'm going to talk about could result in the loss of hundreds or thousands of dollars potentially for an unsuspecting collector who may have wound up with one of them. First up, Journey into Mystery 83. 3 copies of that book were on this list. My assumption there would be whether we're switching out incomplete green label copies, switching out purple label copies into the universal label holder, and then the alleged scammer holding on to the actual blue label books. So, the classic double dip like we've all talked about up to this point. Next up, Giant Size X-Men 1 had 2 copies of that. An Amazing Fantasy 15. That's terrifying. That could be a major loss. I mean, that could easily be a 5-figure loss potentially for the collector that currently has that book. As a guy who has a purple label AF15, I can tell you that it's got a pretty hard ceiling on it. And even with the values of that book coming back a little, your purple copy has a pretty low ceiling compared to really even the entry-level prices of blue label copies from grades below. So that could be a major loss for somebody right there. Additionally, a couple more modern books. There was 1 Walking Dead 1 that was included on the list, and 1 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #1 was listed as well. So as you can see, there's a lot of books we've got to hunt down and try and locate at this point, get them to CGC, and see just how deep this rabbit hole goes. I'm looking forward to some updates from CGC as these books begin to flow in and they get to take a look. And hopefully we did catch this guy fairly early on, and this doesn't go as wide and as deep as we all fear it may. There's a lot of turmoil in the community right now. The never slabbers are loving life. Everybody who is pro slab is apprehensive. There's just it's a mess. It's great. But CGC is making moves that I think are going to be the best thing they can do. They want to review the books. They want to get the bad numbers purged out of existence, and they're doing everything they can to build back the trust that's been lost. What scares me is that there's some other content creators out there that have basically shown the world how they can subvert CGC and CBS's up to this point relatively well regarded security with their slabs, and how they can just take that and completely upend it in a matter of seconds. So I don't know that that's the best thing to put out there. I guess it's better for everybody to be aware that it can happen, to give us a heads up of what to look for. But I also think we just taught tens or hundreds of people how to do this. And the last thing we need is this going on at any kind of scale. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Stay tuned. We will keep up with this as new developments come out. I'm not going to bang this drum every single day, but when something noteworthy does happen, I'll probably touch base on it. Everybody take care, collect responsibly, and I'll see you in the next video.